You know, when you requested a deep dive into trauma, I got to admit,
Yeah.
I wasn't quite ready for how intense this medical textbook chapter turned out to be.
Yeah.
We're really getting into like the physics of injury,
Yeah.
the kinds of forces
Right.
that the human body just isn't designed to handle.
It's heavy stuff, no doubt about it. But when you really think about it, like understanding how trauma affects us, like at that basic physical level,
Yeah,
that's knowledge we can actually use.
absolutely.
Yeah.
This isn't some morbid curiosity thing. This
Uh-huh.
is about equipping ourselves to understand these situations better, you know.
Absolutely.
So let's break down this term trauma. Like we're not just talking about, a little bump on the head.
Yeah.
We're talking about any injury where the energy involved just totally overwhelms the body's ability to cope.
Yeah, it's like a system overload,
Yeah.
right? Our bodies can take so much, but
Right.
at a certain point you cross that line, and
Yeah.
that's when you see the really serious consequences of trauma.
And one of the most, unfortunately, common places we see this is with car accidents, right?
Absolutely.
In our source material, it gets into some really fascinating detail here. Like, imagine you're at the scene of an accident, twisted metal, shattered glass.
Mm.
It's easy to get caught up in the damage to the car itself.
Right. But the real key is understanding how that external damage translates to what's going on inside the vehicle.
Yeah.
It all comes back to this idea of energy transfer.
And that's where things get really interesting because it's not just about the size and the weight of the car, right? It's the speed.
Right.
The textbook uses this example
Yeah.
of a bullet versus a baseball bat, which sounds crazy,
Yeah,
but it totally makes the point.
exactly. A bullet might be tiny, but
Yeah.
that velocity,
Yeah.
the speed at which it travels,
Right.
means it carries an immense amount of energy. A baseball bat, much larger,
Yeah.
doesn't even come close.
So even though it's smaller, that bolt's going to do a lot more damage because it's moving so much faster.
Exactly.
It's like that saying, it's not the fall that kills you, it's the sudden stop at the end, right?
Precisely. Think about it in the context of a car crash. The faster the car is going, the more energy it has. And when
Yeah.
it crashes, that energy has to go somewhere.
Right.
And unfortunately, that often means it's absorbed by the people inside.
And that leads us to this idea of the three collisions.
Yeah.
Can you break down what those are?
Sure. The first collision is the most obvious, the car slamming into another object.
Right.
But the real danger to the people inside is what happens in the second and third collisions.
Okay, so the second collision is when the passengers hit something inside the car, right? The
Right.
dashboard, the steering wheel.
Exactly.
This is where things like seatbelts and airbags are so important.
Absolutely. But the third collision is the one that's often overlooked,
Okay.
and it can be the most dangerous.
Okay.
This is the collision of the passenger's internal organs against their own body.
Wait, can you give me an example of that?
Imagine your head hitting the steering wheel.
Okay.
That's the second collision.
Right.
But your brain inside your skull is still moving forward. So it slams into the inside of your skull, and that can happen even if you don't see any external injuries.
That's kind of terrifying. It's like a hidden danger.
Exactly. And that's why you can have what seem like relatively minor crashes where people walk away with serious internal injuries because that force is transmitted to their organs.
So that's what they mean by internal bleeding.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it highlights why immediate medical attention is so crucial after any significant impact, even if you feel okay initially.
Okay, so we've got this energy transfer and these three collisions.
Right.
But the textbook also mentions something called potential energy.
Yeah.
How does that fit into all of this?
So think of potential energy as stored energy.
Okay.
Imagine someone standing on a diving board.
Okay.
The higher they climb, the more potential energy they have because of gravity.
Right.
When they jump, that potential energy is converted into kinetic energy, the energy of motion.
Okay.
The higher the dive, the harder the impact with the water.
So if you're falling from a height, it's not just about hitting the ground, it's about how far you fell to begin with.
Precisely, the higher the fall, the more potential energy is converted into kinetic energy upon impact.
Yeah.
And that means a greater potential for injury.
Hmm.
It's basic physics.
Wow. So even if you're not in a car, these same principles of energy and impact apply to falls and other types of accidents.
Absolutely.
It really makes you realize how vulnerable the human body can be.
Yeah.
So we've established that like energy transfer and impact are kind of the key ingredients when we're talking about trauma.
Right.
But how does this actually like play out in different types of crashes? Like we all know car accidents are dangerous, but are some types of crashes worse than others?
Oh, absolutely. And understanding the kinds of injuries you typically see with different crash types can be really eye-opening, even life-saving. Let's start with frontal crashes. Those are the most common type.
Right.
And you'd think with airbags we'd be in better shape,
Yeah.
but it's not always that straightforward.
Yeah. I always just figured airbag goes off, you're cushioned, end of story.
Right.
But the textbook was talking about how it's really about the direction of the force.
Exactly. Picture this. You hit a wall head on, your body's thrown forward, then back.
Right.
The airbag is designed to protect you from that initial forward impact,
Right.
but you still have the steering wheel, the dashboard,
Right.
and don't forget about that third collision, your organs hitting your own rib cage.
It's almost like your body's a pinball bouncing around inside the car.
In a way, it is. And this is where wearing your seatbelt correctly is so important. The textbook even mentioned if it's too high, it can damage abdominal organs, and if it's too low, it can cause hip dislocations.
Well, it's not just about wearing a seatbelt, it's about wearing it properly.
Absolutely.
I guess this is a good reminder to actually look at those car manual instructions.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about rear-end collisions. This is where we see a lot of whiplash injuries.
Right, because your car is suddenly thrust forward,
Right.
but your head kind of stays put for a second.
Yeah. Exactly. Inertia wants to keep your head in place, so it snaps backward, then forward.
Ouch.
This is why headrests are so important. They're not just for comfort on long drives.
Right.
They're there to limit how far back your head can move in that initial impact.
I'll admit, I've totally been guilty of using my headrest as a pillow on road trips. Not anymore.
Good, because that split-second decision can make a world of difference.
Ow.
Now, lateral crashes or T-bone collisions, those are a different beast altogether.
Because you're getting hit from the side where there's just less car to absorb the impact.
Exactly. Your car is essentially pushed into you.
Right.
You've got the potential for really serious head and neck injuries from your head hitting the window or the other car. Plus, your chest and abdomen are taking a direct hit, increasing the risk of rib fractures, lung injuries, even damage to the aorta, which is a major blood vessel.
It's crazy how just understanding the physics of these crashes makes you a more aware driver.
Yeah.
Knowing where the vulnerabilities are in different crash types makes you think twice about things like blind spots and following distances.
Absolutely. And it highlights why safety features like side airbags are becoming standard in newer vehicles. They're designed to address that specific vulnerability in side impacts.
Okay, so we've covered 3 of the major car crash types: frontal, rear end, and lateral. What about rollovers? Those seem especially chaotic.
They are. And the biggest danger in a rollover is ejection.
Right.
If you're not wearing a seatbelt, you're basically a projectile inside a tumbling metal box.
That's terrifying. But even with a seatbelt, you're still at risk of getting tossed around inside the car.
Exactly. And that's where the unpredictability of rollovers comes in. You might hit the roof one moment, the side window the next.
Right.
It's a recipe for multiple injuries to multiple body regions.
So with rollovers, it's all about like minimizing your risk as much as possible, like seatbelts, obviously.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes you think twice about having loose objects in the car that could turn into projectiles.
Absolutely. And being mindful of factors that can contribute to rollovers in the first place, like speeding, driving under the influence, or even just driving on unfamiliar or hazardous roads. It all ties into that bigger picture of prevention.
Right, because knowledge is power, but only if you use it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with car crashes, which are obviously a major source of trauma. But what about those who aren't in cars when trauma happens? Pedestrians, cyclists, motorcyclists, they're facing a whole other set of risks.
Yeah, unfortunately, in those cases, the human body often takes the brunt of the impact. You don't have that metal cage to absorb the energy, so the injuries tend to be much more severe.
And with motorcycles specifically, there's this whole concept of laying the bike down that I found so interesting. Like, it seems counterintuitive to purposely crash your bike, but the textbook explains that it can actually be a strategic maneuver.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of using knowledge of physics to your advantage in a really high-stakes situation.
Right. So instead of hitting an obstacle head-on, a skilled rider might choose to lay the bike down on its side, separating themselves from the bike before that main impact.
So it's like choosing a controlled slide instead of a head-on collision.
Exactly.
But that still comes with its own risks, right?
Of course. It takes incredible skill timing and proper safety gear to pull it off successfully. But in certain situations, it can be the difference between life-threatening injuries and a much less severe outcome.
It's amazing what a difference a split-second decision can make when you're dealing with these forces.
Absolutely. And it just goes to show that understanding these concepts isn't just for medical professionals.
Right.
It's relevant for anyone who gets behind the wheel, rides a motorcycle, or even just walks down the street.
Speaking of different types of trauma, we've talked a lot about blunt force trauma from car crashes and falls. But what about penetrating trauma? That seems like a whole other ballgame.
It is. Penetrating trauma involves objects that pierce the skin and enter the body, like stab wounds or gunshot wounds.
Right.
And what's interesting here is that The severity of a penetrating injury isn't always immediately obvious.
Okay.
A small entry wound can actually mask some pretty significant internal damage.
And that's where the depth of penetration and the movement of the object inside the body become really critical factors.
Precisely. A stab wound might look small on the surface, but if that knife was twisted or moved around internally, it could have severed arteries, damaged organs, things you wouldn't necessarily see just by looking at the external wound.
Right. And then there are gunshot wounds, which I imagine come with their own set of complexity.
Absolutely. And again, it's not just about the size of the bullet, but the velocity.
Right.
A small, fast-moving bullet can do significantly more damage than a larger, slower one because of something called cavitation.
Cavitation. That sounds intense. What is that exactly?
So imagine a bullet ripping through tissue. It creates this kind of shockwave, like a miniature explosion inside the body.
Wow.
This shockwave can actually cause damage far beyond the bullet's direct path, injuring organs and tissues that weren't even touched by the bullet itself.
So you could have a gunshot wound where the entry and exit wounds seem relatively small,
Yeah.
but the internal damage could be really extensive because of this cavitation effect.
Exactly. And that makes treating gunshot wounds particularly challenging because you're not just dealing with the visible damage, you're dealing with this whole cascade of potential internal injuries.
It kind of makes those medical dramas on TV seem a bit less dramatic and a lot more realistic.
Right. And it really highlights why knowledge of these mechanisms is so powerful.
Yeah.
It allows us to make more informed decisions in an emergency advocate for ourselves and others in a medical setting and have a much deeper understanding of the challenges that first responders face every day.
Okay. So we've covered car crashes, falls, stabbings, gunshot wounds. It's a lot.
It is.
But there's one more type of trauma we need to talk about, and it's one that's becoming increasingly relevant. Unfortunately, blast injuries.
Yeah, blast injuries are unique because they can combine elements of both blunt and penetrating trauma, often with multiple injuries happening all at once. And they really highlight the fact that trauma isn't always a linear event. There can be delayed effects and complications that arise long after that initial injury.
The textbook talked about how blast injuries are categorized into 4 types: primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. It's almost like an explosion creates this ripple effect of injuries.
It's a great analogy. The primary injury is caused by the initial pressure wave from the blast, which can cause devastating internal injuries even without any external signs of trauma.
So you could have someone who looks relatively unharmed on the outside, but has severe internal damage from the force of that pressure wave.
Exactly. Then you have secondary injuries, which are caused by flying debris, shrapnel glass fragments, anything turned into a projectile by the force of the blast.
So it's like the explosion creates its own shrapnel storm, with each piece potentially causing a separate injury. Then there are tertiary injuries, which are a result of the person being thrown by the blast wave.
Right. It's like a force multiplier, where the initial blast doesn't just cause damage at the point of impact, it can actually propel someone through the air, leading to additional injuries when they collide with other objects or the ground.
And then on top of all that, you have what are called quaternary injuries, which encompass everything else: burns, crush injuries, respiratory problems from inhaling toxic fumes or smoke. Like, blast injuries are the ultimate trauma cocktail with the potential for such a wide range of injuries all at once.
Exactly. And that's what makes treating blast injuries so incredibly complex.
Right.
You're not dealing with a single injury, you're dealing with this whole constellation of injuries, often to multiple organ systems that can interact in really unpredictable ways.
It makes you realize just how fragile the human body is, but also how resilient it can be. It's both humbling and kind of inspiring to learn about how the body responds to trauma.
I agree. And while we've covered a ton of ground today, I think the main takeaway is that understanding these mechanisms of trauma, the forces involved, the types of injuries, the potential for long-term consequences, that knowledge is something that empowers all of us.
Absolutely.
It allows us to be more aware of the risks, more prepared to respond in an emergency, and more compassionate towards those who have experienced trauma.
It's about going beyond that fear factor
Yeah.
and really embracing the power of knowledge. Next time I see a news report about a car accident or hear about a natural disaster, I'll be able to think about it differently. I'll understand the forces at play, the types of injuries people might have sustained, the challenges first responders are facing, and maybe, just maybe, that knowledge will inspire me to be a little more prepared, a little more compassionate, and a little more grateful for those who dedicate their lives to helping others in those really critical moments.
That's the beauty of a good deep dive.
Yeah.
It's not just about acquiring information, it's about transforming that information into understanding, empathy, and action.